Ladies and gentlemen, Asian guy here. I need you to stop what you're doing right now. Put down your phone, turn off the noise. Because what I'm about to show you isn't a prediction. It isn't a theory. It's happening right now. While you're watching this video, the largest wealth transfer in American history has already begun. And the trigger wasn't Wall Street. It wasn't the Federal Reserve. It was Beijing. 3 days ago, something shifted in the global financial system that most analysts completely missed. The mainstream media buried it on page 12. Your financial advisor doesn't even know it happened. But I'm going to show you the exact moment when trillions of dollars started flowing out of American hands and into Chinese vaults. This isn't about trade wars or tariffs. This is about something much deeper, much more dangerous. This is about China systematically draining the economic lifeblood of the United States. And they're using our own system against us. The surface event looks innocent enough. On January 1st, China implemented what they called export license requirements for strategic materials. Silver, lithium, rare earths, graphite, standard bureaucratic language. Fill out forms, pay fees, nothing dramatic. The financial press called it administrative housekeeping. But that surface story is a lie. This wasn't housekeeping. This was economic warfare disguised as paperwork. Here's what really happened. For decades, American companies built their entire business model on one assumption. Chinese raw materials would always be cheap and available. Apple, Tesla, every solar company, every tech giant, every defense contractor assumed they could just pick up the phone and order whatever they needed from China at commodity prices. They treated the Chinese supply chain like their personal warehouse. No inventory, no stockpiles. Just-in-time delivery from the Middle Kingdom, that assumption just died. When Beijing flipped the switch on those export licenses, they didn't just create paperwork, they created scarcity, real physical scarcity. Because here's what the licenses actually do. They make it impossible for small and medium Chinese exporters to ship materials to the West. The capital requirements, the approval processes, the production minimums, they're designed to eliminate everyone except the state-controlled giants. China just centralized control of every strategic material that American industry depends on. But this is where things stop making sense. If China wanted to hurt American industry, why didn't they just ban exports entirely? Why create this complex licensing system? Because an outright ban would be obvious economic warfare. It would trigger retaliation. It would force America to find alternatives. The licensing system is much more insidious. It creates the illusion of open markets, while China quietly turns off the tap. They want American companies to keep trying to buy. They want them to keep building factories and making promises to shareholders. They want the dependency to deepen. Because every month that passes, every gigafactory that gets built, every solar panel contract that gets signed, America becomes more desperate for Chinese materials. And desperate customers pay premium prices. This is where the wealth transfer begins. Look at what happened to Tesla this week. Elon Musk's tweet was 8 words. This is not good for future production. 8 words that sent the stock down 3% in after-hours trading. But those 8 words revealed something terrifying. The world's most valuable automaker, the company that promised to revolutionize transportation, just admitted they don't control their own supply chain. They admitted they're dependent on a foreign government for their most basic materials. They admitted they're vulnerable. They admitted the future they promised depends on Chinese permission. And they're not alone. Apple uses Chinese graphite for every iPhone battery. Samsung uses Chinese rare earths for every screen. Boeing uses Chinese materials for every defense contract. The entire American tech boom, the entire green energy transition, the entire military-industrial complex is built on Chinese foundations. And Beijing just announced they control the off switch. But here's where the story gets darker. China didn't just wake up one morning and decide to implement export controls. This was planned. This was prepared. For the last 5 years, while American companies were focused on quarterly earnings and stock buybacks, China was quietly building strategic reserves. They accumulated massive stockpiles of their own materials. They locked up supply chains across Africa and South America. They built refineries and processing facilities that American industry can't replicate. They engineered a trap, a sophisticated multi-decade trap that required patience, planning, and perfect execution. And American industry walked right into it. They walked into it willingly, eagerly, chasing quarterly profits, while ignoring the steel jaws closing around their supply chains. They traded strategic independence for cost savings. They traded national security for shareholder returns. The data is undeniable. In 2019, China held approximately 60 million ounces of silver in government reserves. Today, that number is approaching 300 million ounces. They quadrupled their stockpile while telling American companies that supply was unlimited. They hoarded the materials while encouraging American dependency. They built their fortress while America built more factories that require Chinese materials to operate. This wasn't free market competition. This was strategic deception. And now the trap is closing. American companies are waking up to find that the materials they need aren't just expensive. They're unavailable at any price from anyone except China. The Chinese state companies that got the export licenses aren't interested in competitive pricing. They're interested in maximum extraction. They're setting prices based on desperation, not production costs. Tesla needs silver for every electric vehicle. China has the silver. The price is whatever China says it is. Apple needs rare earths for every iPhone. China has the rare earths. The price is whatever China says it is. The American military needs lithium for every weapon system. China controls the lithium. The price is whatever China says it is. This is the moment when China stops being a supplier and becomes a landlord. They're not selling materials. They're renting access to the modern economy, and the rent just went up. But the wealth transfer isn't just happening in commodity markets, it's happening in currency markets. Because when American companies pay premium prices for Chinese materials, they're not paying in yuan, they're paying in dollars. Every overpriced ton of lithium, every marked up ounce of silver, every inflated shipment of rare earths represents dollars flowing from American balance sheets to Chinese reserves. China is systematically draining dollar liquidity from American industry. They're forcing American companies to bid against each other for access to Chinese materials. They're creating artificial scarcity that drives up prices and maximizes dollar extraction. It's the most sophisticated wealth transfer mechanism in history, and it's completely legal. The Federal Reserve sees what's happening. They see American companies hemorrhaging cash to Chinese suppliers. They see strategic materials flowing east while dollars flow west at an accelerating pace, and they're terrified. Because they realize that China has found a way to tax American prosperity without declaring war. They've found a way to make American success dependent on Chinese permission. They've turned the dollar itself into a weapon against American industry. This is economic vassalage disguised as free trade. The numbers are staggering. American companies collectively spend approximately $400 billion per year on materials that China now controls through licensing. Even a modest price increase of 20% represents $80 billion in additional costs. That's $80 billion flowing directly from American shareholders to Chinese state enterprises. Every quarter, every year, forever. But the real transfer isn't just money, it's power. China isn't just taking American dollars. They're taking American industrial capacity. Because every factory that shuts down due to material shortages is a factory that China can replace with their own production. Every American company that struggles with supply chains is market share that Chinese competitors can capture. China is using material scarcity to hollow out American manufacturing. They're making it impossible for American companies to compete on cost, while offering their own companies unlimited access to materials at subsidized prices. It's reverse dumping. Instead of flooding American markets with cheap goods, they're starving American production of cheap inputs. And there's no immediate escape. America can't just flip a switch and replace Chinese supplies. The rare earth processing facilities take decades to build. The silver mines take years to develop. The lithium refineries require environmental permits that can take longer than the materials will last. China has a 20-year head start, and they're using every day of that advantage to extract maximum wealth from American dependence. The tragedy is that America had warnings. For years, national security experts warned about critical material dependencies. They warned about supply chain vulnerabilities. They warned about the risks of relying on strategic competitors for strategic materials. But American corporations ignored the warnings because Chinese supplies were cheap and reliable. They chose short-term profits over long-term security. They chose quarterly earnings over strategic independence. And now they're paying the price. Literally. But the wealth transfer is accelerating. Because as American companies struggle with higher material costs, their stock prices fall, their valuations drop, their market capitalizations shrink, and Chinese companies, backed by abundant cheap materials and state support, are using this moment to acquire American assets at discounted prices. Chinese sovereign wealth funds are circling weakened American companies like vultures. They're offering to solve material supply problems in exchange for equity stakes. They're providing loans backed by strategic materials in exchange for technology transfers. They're turning American industrial desperation into Chinese ownership of American innovation. This is the moment when dependency becomes subjugation. The American government sees what's happening. They see strategic industries being systematically weakened. They see supply chains being weaponized. They see wealth flowing east at an unprecedented pace, and they're scrambling to respond. Emergency stockpile purchases, critical materials initiatives, supply chain reshoring programs. But every emergency measure reveals American weakness. Every stockpile purchase drives up Chinese profits. Every reshoring initiative takes years to implement while the transfer continues. China engineered a position where American responses either accelerate the wealth transfer or arrive too late to matter. The Federal Reserve is trapped in the same dynamics. They can print money to help American companies pay Chinese premium prices, but printing money devalues the dollar, making American purchasing power even weaker relative to Chinese materials, Or they can maintain dollar strength, forcing American companies to compete for scarce materials with expensive currency, accelerating bankruptcies and Chinese acquisitions. Every policy response makes the problem worse. Chinese strategists call this peaceful rising. They're not using military force. They're not breaking international laws. They're simply leveraging natural resource control and supply chain dominance to redistribute global wealth. They're making American prosperity dependent on Chinese permission. And permission comes with a price. The price is paid in dollars, in technology transfers, in market access, in strategic independence. America is trading its industrial future for temporary access to Chinese materials. And China is accumulating not just American wealth, but American capabilities. This transfer isn't temporary, it's structural. China isn't planning to lower prices when American companies adjust to the new reality. They're planning to raise them. Because dependency deepens over time. Because alternatives take decades to develop. Because American industrial capacity continues to rely on Chinese materials for every expansion, every innovation, every competitive advantage. China is creating a system where American success requires Chinese approval, where American growth generates Chinese wealth, where American innovation depends on Chinese supply lines. They're not conquering America militarily. They're purchasing it economically. And they're using American money to finance the transaction. The wealth transfer is only beginning. As Chinese export licenses tighten, prices will rise. As American companies struggle with costs, Chinese competitors will gain market share. As American industrial capacity weakens, Chinese capacity will expand. The gap will widen every quarter. We're watching the systematic deindustrialization of America, funded by American companies and orchestrated by Chinese strategy. The biggest wealth transfer in history isn't happening through war or revolution. It's happening through invoices and supply contracts and export licenses. China is proving that control over strategic materials is more powerful than control over strategic territories. They're proving that economic dependency is more effective than military occupation. They're proving that the nation that controls the supply chains controls the future. They're proving that patience defeats aggression, that strategy defeats strength, and right now they're proving it with American money. The transfer has begun, the wealth is flowing, and Beijing is just getting started.